So, can you tell me about Eric?
Yeah, so Eric came to me about 6 weeks into the school year last year, and he had a severe hearing impairment in both ears. One is more severe than the other, but they're both pretty severe due to like surgeries that he had as a child. So, well, he's still a child, as like a 2-year-old. So he had not learned to sign and had not learned to talk really either. So he kind of came not only as a child with a hearing loss, but with no communication. Very, very basic communication. He'd done a little bit of PECS, like picture exchange communication, but very minimal and not really done right, I don't think, when he was in kindergarten at his old school. And he basically communicated by pointing and making sounds, but really had no language or structure for language. So,
Okay. So, what kind of supports and needs did Eric have?
so Eric's needs were huge because he didn't have any language. So some of those we did in the classroom. Then obviously he had really intensive work with a speech pathologist who was not trying to get him to talk, but was working on PECS, picture exchange, to teach him sentence structure and using words like the and a and that kind of thing. And the basics of PECS, because that just gives meaning to language reciprocity for him. So like he had no idea that if he asked for a specific thing, he would get something else in return. You know, like we had to go that fundamental with the PECS, and that system had to be in place here in this classroom, in his special ed classroom, and then in all of his settings. So he didn't practice PECS with me specifically. Like he did his work with it upstairs in his special ed classroom, but he had to use it in here, and his aide had him use it. And then gradually, what we figured out is that Eric's capacity for language was much greater than what usually is for kids with PECS. So we ended up sort of getting ready to get him a signing aide, someone who was fluent in sign and could teach him some sign, because we figured his ability to articulate himself in sign was going to be, his needs would be a lot better met that way. In here, prior to like his advances that he ended up making, we labeled everything with pictures. We did a lot of, he would be able to bring us a picture of something we needed. So that was a really big modification. I mean, he couldn't ever hear my instructions, so a lot of his work was just, you know, he had a whole work system where he would work for a few minutes and then get a sticker, and then he would be working for something. So it's called a token economy. We did that for him because there was no real way to communicate to him that he needed to like sit down and get work done. Without that, it was a really good visual cue for that. So that's an accommodation we had in both settings for him. Yeah, I mean, he needed a ton. He needed to learn how to like sit down and work in a classroom too. And like, I think what I was most surprised about with him is that total not having any much language at all. I mean, his behavior was really difficult, and he would scream, and he couldn't really hear himself. So of course he was doing that, but it was a very like disruptive situation. So we definitely had to get that under control, and the token economy really helped. So
Awesome.
yeah.
So, prior to getting to spend a year with Eric, what misconceptions did you have about the hearing impaired? If any.
Yeah, I think that for me, well, one of the biggest ones, and it was so fascinating to me to hear about when we had his IEP meeting, there was an audiologist that came in and talked about what sounds Eric can hear. So like one of my big misconceptions about people that are hearing impaired is that most of them can hear nothing, which is almost never true according to this audiologist. There are people that are completely deaf, but a lot of people just don't hear certain sounds. And she talked all about the kinds of sounds that Eric could hear and what he couldn't hear, and like what the nature of his hearing loss was, which I found really interesting. And he's a kid that's really sensitive to noise, even though he is hearing impaired. So like when the fire alarm goes off, he really has a lot of sensory like issues with that. So that surprised me, because I was like, well, you can barely hear it probably, right? But I don't, it's not really that simple, obviously. So yeah, those were definitely some misconceptions. And then, I mean, that this kid could be 2 and not have been taught sign, or I mean that he could go from losing his hearing around 2 to being 6, 7 years old with no real system in place for developing language was really surprising to me. I feel like, you assume that if that happens to a kid when they're that little, that the supports are in place for parents to help them learn what they need to do with that child, and I don't know that that's necessarily true. So that was a really big surprise to me.
I bet. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing.